board. Let's see here. Okay. All right. Well, welcome tonight, y'all. For some of you, this is your, I've lost count. I don't know, third or fourth Monday night session. So we started this a couple of weeks ago, which was pre-coronavirus, and then it morphed into becoming a Monday night ritual. So we're into, I guess this is the second of that series or whatever. So tonight we're going to be talking about companion plants in the garden. It's all about creating that biodiverse ecosystem in your garden, which for those of you that know me know I'm pretty passionate about that topic. And it's just pretty cool how plants, we can utilize them to the best of their benefit, which ultimately just ends up benefiting us and the environment, our pollinators, as Carol Reese often refers to, the birds and the bees. So we'll just jump right in here. If you do have questions, utilize the chat box. Because I can't see all that going on at one time, or feel free to unmute yourself and jump in. Try to keep yourself muted. We had a little bit of feedback earlier. I think most of you know how to utilize that button, which is in the bottom left corner there. Just hit your little microphone. If you got the red X through it, it means you're muted. So either way, just utilize that functionality as you see fit. But I do save the chat box and go back to that later, so if you have any burning questions, feel free to put them in there, or just stay on till after the presentation, and I'll be happy to answer questions. But anyway, again, tonight is more about companion plants, and a lot of our herbs are going to serve as those companion plants in the garden, which in a couple of weeks we're going to delve into herbs a little bit deeper. Tonight is more about getting acquainted with those plant families and how they're associated with one another, and learning what those families are and how they relate to one another, or maybe sometimes they don't relate very well to one another. So we're going to move through each one of these vegetable families, and you'll notice there at the top, I don't know if you can see that, but plangarden.com. It's a really cool website, and you can actually go in there and plug in, you know, like do your crop rotation and things like that, and it's going to help you with all of these garden families too, so you can kind of plan that out from year to year. So of course we start out with one that we're probably most all familiar with, which is the nightshade family, or the solanaceous crops. And this is where the majority of our most favorite garden vegetables belong in this family here. You can see the tomato listed there, the peppers and potatoes, eggplants, all of those are going to be in this nightshade family. But you'll also notice some other pictures there. Tobacco and petunia and belladonna, which is also referred to as nightshade, which is a weed. It's a very toxic weed. But when we talk about families in the garden, you know, we need to include all of these because they all share the same characteristics. So when we're talking about crop rotation later in the fall, when we start planning for our 2021 garden, we want to remember these plant families, because we don't want to be following bell peppers with tomatoes or eggplants with potatoes and things like that, because otherwise you risk the potential of introducing disease organisms into those crops, because the same disease and pests that affect one are going to affect them all, if that makes sense. So it used to be that when tobacco was grown pretty prolifically here, we would run into occurrences of viruses and different bacterial diseases because folks would follow their tobacco crops with tomatoes. So oftentimes we would see that from year to year in those different crops. So just keep that in mind as you're planning your garden. The other cool thing about nightshades is that they have alkaloid properties. Some of those alkaloids can be pretty toxic, can be pretty poisonous. Scopolamine, atropine, nicotine, of course, are all some of those secondary alkaloids that are, you know, going to be present in some of these toxic plants. Gypsum weed, that's another one that's also in this family. So if anybody's ever heard of, you know, the teenagers years ago that would smoke Timpson weed, it was for those hallucinogenic effects from smoking it. It was from those terpenes, secondary alkaloids in those plants. Okay, the next family is our mustard group, or our brassica family. And oftentimes you'll hear some of these words used simultaneously. Brassicas, cold crops, and those are cold, not cold, even though they are considered a cool season. You'll see that listed right there next to cabbage, brassica. But all of these belong to the brassica family. These are all of our cruciferous vegetables. That's another term that you're going to hear used interchangeably. There's about 3,700 species of these worldwide. We've also got some flowers that fall into this, just to let you know. Money plant, candy tuft, wasabi, horseradish, sweet alyssum, woad. I don't know if anybody's familiar with woad. That's a really cool herb. We'll speak on that one a little bit later. But it looks very similar to mustard, but they utilize it for dyeing purposes. And I don't know if, yeah, radish is on here. And then bittercress, some people consider that a weed, but that also falls into this family. Next up is our Fabaceae family, which are our legumes. Those are our nitrogen fixing families. Many different species fall in this category, and oftentimes we just limit that to beans and peas, but there's so much more to this family. As a matter of fact, there's over 20,000 species worldwide. A lot of our cover crops that you hear me speak to in the fall are in this family. Vetch and clover both fall into this. Hyacinth beans. As far as trees, red buds, the Kentucky coffee tree, mimosas, wisteria, all of those are going to be in the same family. So is kudzu, astragalus. I don't know if anybody knows that adaptogenic herb, but all of those are here. And then, of course, peanut. We don't want to leave that one out. And then a lot of people eat carob, which is the Glenn, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what a lot of folks will use for cocoa. Yeah, okay, I'm getting a nod from him. So a lot of different things are going to fall into this category. And you'll notice there from the pictures, the vetch, the alfalfa, the clover, again, those are things that we're going to use as forage legumes. We're going to use those as cover crops. More folks are starting to use the lupines, but some folks, again, are going to consider those weeds. It just depends on what you're going to utilize those for in your garden setting as to whether they're a pest or not. Next up, we have our cucurbit family, and often I will use the word cucurbit instead of saying squash and cucumbers just because it's easier. But basically, the cucurbit family is anything that vines or has a tendril. Actually, that's the true definition of a cucurbit. It's anything that has that little tendril on it, and I don't have a picture of that to show you, but there's about 1,000 different species of these. These are where all of our melons and winter squash, gourds, pumpkin, and even loofah are going to fall into this family. And then our Alliaceae family, and again, probably about 1,500 species of these. This is an interesting plant family because it was first classified years ago in the lily family. So for those of you that dig ramps this time of year can probably recognize why, because probably the ramps more so than some of these pictures I have here demonstrate those qualities of the lily family a little bit better. But any of the chives, leeks, onions, all of those are going to fall into this family. The Apiaceae family, or the parsley family, we've got some pests in this family, but we've got some good crunchers that come out of this family too. You see the parsnips and the carrots listed there. We've got several herbs that are going to fall into this category. Of course, dill, parsley and cilantro, angelica, lovage. Some of you may be familiar with those. But then we also have the hogweeds and the poison hemlock that are going to fall into this family too. And they all have that, kind of see from that dill picture there, it's what we call an umbrella shaped flower head. So that's what's characteristic of the Apiaceae family here. And Queen Anne's lace, some of you are familiar with that, or what Sheila refers to as the chiggerweed. Our amaranth family, which is spinach and amaranth. Many people will interchange pigweeds, the red root pigweed, which is also a common weed. It's starting to be more and more of a problem here, but especially invasive in West Tennessee and some of the row crops out there. But so it's interesting that beets, Swiss chard, and spinach are all in that same family. Some of you know the weed lamb's quarters. Some of you might grow, what is that flower? Coxcomb, celosia. That is in this family. Gomphrena, or the little, I forgot what the common name is for that, the little globe flowers that we use as a little hedge in our flower beds. And quinoa, all of those fall into this family. And then the lettuce, Latuca sativa, is actually in the aster family, but we include that here because it is a vegetable. It's one that we eat, and we want to be rotating that through, although it's not as critical with this family as it is with some of the others. So many different species of this exist worldwide, but the interesting thing again is that it is a member of the aster family. The mint family probably needs no introduction. This is one that most people want to be really careful with because it can get out of control if you plant it bare ground. So, of course, henbit, dead nettle, which some of us consider weeds, some of us don't. You know, some of us actually will utilize that as a food source. Just depends on your preference there. But anything basically that has that square stem is going to be in the mint family. That's what's characteristic of that grouping. And you see some of our more common herbs that are going to be listed also in this larger family of the mint family, or the Lamiaceae family. Horehound is in this family. That's probably one of the mints that you can get away with actually planting that will not spread like some of the other mints. And it's one of those that's also considered one of those moonlight plants that you hear me refer to because it's got that grayish white foliage that kind of glows in the moonlight. So pretty cool. One of the mints that does grow pretty vigorously but won't spread out of control. And then we just have this grouping called all others. So you see rhubarb pictured there. That's actually a member of the I can't say that word. The smartweed family, Polygonia family. Asparagus is actually a member of the lily family. Okra, that's the one that has the really big pretty flowers. So think about what that looks similar to. Cotton, hibiscus, marshmallow, all of those are in the Malvasia family, or the mallow family. And then of course corn is technically a grass, so it's in the Poa family. And then artichoke is another one that we're going to find in the aster family. And just a word of caution when we talk about artichokes, we're referring to the actual globe artichoke that you see pictured there, not the Jerusalem artichoke. And some of the sunflower chokes, sunchokes that we see, those are a different species altogether. All right, so why do we go through all those plant families? Why is that so critical? Because again, we want to grow diversity in our gardens, whether we're growing vegetable gardens, flower gardens, herb gardens, or whatever. So you'll notice there, when we use plants with different nutrient requirements and we're rooting, or plants that require different rooting depths, we're actually going to create a more biological diverse ecosystem, which is going to be better in the long run. Plus, you're going to be able to cramp a lot more plants in a smaller space. So if space is an issue, we can utilize some of these intercropping techniques that's going to be a little bit better long-term for sustainability in your gardens. Just some notes here. Some plants are going to be natural growth stimulants for other plants, and then some are going to be natural growth inhibitors. And we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about some of these. But think about probably a classic example is the black walnut tree. You can't grow tomatoes under a black walnut because of that juglans, which is in the root system of the black walnut. So it'll just completely stunt your tomato plants from growing. So that's what we mean by a natural growth inhibitor. And then that last point, some plants are going to have the capacity to go really, really deep. Their taproot's going to go deep into the soil, and they're going to mine for some of those secondary nutrients. You know, oftentimes when we think about fertility, we think about our traditional N, P, and K, but we have 16 other nutrients that are very important. So some of these are going to be able to mine for those nutrients down deep and bring them up to be more available for some of our other plants. So again, it's just about creating suitable microclimates for one plant by utilizing shade from another. And we can do this by allowing some of our larger plants to serve as shade and wind protection. A lot of folks don't think you can grow lettuce, onions, maybe even radishes throughout the heat of the long summer months that we have here in East Tennessee, but you can. Just wait till you get a little bit of a canopy, and then you can interplant those in between your rows. Remember that some plants are going to confuse insect pests just because of their strong smell. Shape and color are also going to provide that confusion, just the texture of the overall landscape. And then depending on what you're trying to achieve, predator birds and insects and other wildlife can be invited into your garden, or some of those plants are going to serve as a barrier to some of those pests. So going back to root depth and kind of how that works, you can see when we combine those shallow rooted vegetables with some of those deep rooted and even medium root depths, we can again, for lack of a better word, cram a lot more plants into a smaller area. When we are planting all of these families close together, and you'll notice there, you know, you can plant some of these in between rows. You can, see, this is where I hate Zoom. I can't talk and show with my hands because I've got some pictures at the end that will actually illustrate this a little bit better. So remember this slide, and we'll come back to this, but it'll hopefully show you a little bit better what I'm talking about as far as some of those spatial relationships with root depth and confusing insects. Think back to Three Sisters, because that was probably one of the first schematics that we could utilize for a companion planting garden. It was the Wampanoag Indian tribe that created this, planting our corn, of course, or a sunflower. Some people will utilize that in order for our beans to run up that stalk, and then you would plant pumpkins or squash to serve as shade. So ultimately how these all work together was that the beans, again being a legume, would fix nitrogen from the air into the soil. The corn, being a high nitrogen utilizer, would then utilize that. And then of course you have your shaded pumpkin or squash plant. So when you think companion plants, think about Three Sisters. Now to go back to some of those natural growth stimulants that we were talking about earlier, these plants here have a positive effect on plants that are grown nearby. So chamomile, yarrow, however you pronounce that, wherever you're from, parsley, and lemon balm can all increase vigor of plants. So you see there, they're great to plug in some of those bare gaps that you've got in your garden. Plant those along your garden borders, and then of course you can utilize most of these in teas or for other uses. Just be cautious with that lemon balm, again, because it's a member of the mint family, so it can take over the universe, but it's very fragrant. It's got a very lovely smell, and you see it pictured there. It makes a nice tea. Some plants are going to be natural suppressants. This is just a good illustration here. Never plant strawberries with cold crops, and then you never plant beans or peas with onions, garlics, or leeks. So you can kind of see here from these two sentences why knowing those plant families again is so critical. Of course, we didn't have strawberries listed in that before, but you know, we've had some occurrences with folks because cold crops, broccoli or cauliflower, you're going to plant those early in the season, and sometimes folks would go out and just plant them in a row next to their strawberries that they had planted the season before, but they'll stunt the growth. So you've got to be really careful with that. And the same thing with onions. They're going to stunt the beans and peas. So here's just a solution to that. Beans and onions are going to grow well next to broccoli or cauliflower. So what you'd want to do there is plant that row of beans, then your broccoli, and then your onions. So basically what is happening there is broccoli is going to serve as a barrier plant. So you know how we talk about cedar apple rust in apple trees and removing the cedar tree so we don't get those galls, and then spores float to our apple trees nearby, and it can be literally for miles. Well, it's different here in the garden setting, so it doesn't have to be miles apart for that broccoli to serve as a barrier plant, because we're just thinking about the root capacity of those plants, if that makes sense. We're not talking spores floating by wind or water, so that's why we don't have that great big area that we're talking about. So that's why we call that a barrier plant, and it just kind of helps keeps those root plants apart. Plant roots. Lord, I can't talk. Just another thing, strawberries are a perennial plant, just like your rhubarb and your asparagus. So you want to be mindful of that when you're planting a garden, because you don't want to, you know, have a row of strawberries planted right down the middle of your garden, or even if you're doing raised beds, you know, be very conscientious of that where you're placing each one of those beds. But in general, you just want to keep those perennials and annuals separate, because you don't want to be disturbing that soil as you're placing your cover crop or moving into the next season. And then some of those nutrient providers, I've already spoken about some of those, the peas, the beans, and the clover, all collecting nitrogen from the air. And I don't know if any of you have actually pulled up a clump of that white clover growing in your lawn or not, actually seen some of those nodules that are on the roots. If you've not done that, you might want to go out and just investigate that, explore that. It's kind of cool to see those little nodules actually forming on those roots. And you'll notice there are plant nitrogen fixers next to your leafy vegetables. And we always classify brassicas, any of those cole crops, as a leafy green, because that's what we're eating basically, is those leafy parts of that plant. So they're going to require a huge amount of nitrogen. So any kind of nitrogen fixer that you can plant next to those is going to be beneficial. Here's where I was talking about some of those mining plants. Comfrey is one. I'm going to show you a picture of that root system here in just a minute, but comfrey is very deep rooted. It's going to serve many purposes in the garden. Number one, it's one of the first plants to come up in the springtime. It has beautiful flowers, so it's going to serve as a pollinator source. The bumblebees are just devouring it right now. And then it grows throughout the summer months. Heat doesn't bother it. The only thing that really does bother it is cold weather. It dies back in the winter time. But the cool thing about this plant is that, again, that root system goes down deep and it mines for some of those micronutrients, and it collects it within the leaf and the stems of the plant. Actually, hang on a minute. Let me go to this next picture so you can see that, and I'll go back. But you can see the blooms there. You can see the stockiness of the plant, but look at that root. And I would have brought some of this had we been together tonight, because I have a pretty large quantity of this at home. And those root systems are just massive. The only bad thing about comfrey is when you cut it back, if you cut the root, then another comfrey plant grows from that root. So it can be invasive from that vantage point. But you can cut this plant. Let me get my little pointer since I can't use my fingers. Like this would be actively growing right now, this time of year, all the way through the summer months. You can cut it all the way back anytime during the growing season. Put that on your compost bin or put that in your garden, and it's going to help feed the nutrients to your garden. Let me go back to that. Did I have that in here? Yeah, a lot of fruit tree growers will grow it under their fruit trees. And then borage is another one. About to get ahead of myself. And of course, dandelion, we all have tried to pull dandelions and know how vicious that is to try to just go out there and pluck it with your hand. You really got to have a spade to get that root up. Borage is an annual, but it reseeds itself. And all parts of the borage are going to be edible. Ground cover plants like nasturtiums are going to serve as a ground cover. Sweet alyssum planted in between your potatoes is going to serve as a living mulch. They're going to help trap soil particles, nutrients, and water. And then, of course, the cool thing about nasturtiums is that they create capers. Their little seeds are capers, which is pretty cool. And of course, you can eat the flower too. And they're good to interplant with your beans, which we'll get to that in a few minutes. So just to kind of get us moving into some of these plant benefits, when we plant tomatoes with cabbage, it's going to help us repel the diamondback moth. And of course, this time of year when we start seeing, I put the diamondback here because he's a little multicolored, but the cabbage looper is just a white butterfly, and we see a pretty vast quantity of those this time of year, and we get all excited. Oh, look at the little butterflies. Well, if you grow cabbages or broccoli or any other type of cold crop, you don't like to see those white butterflies because they're going to burrow down into this cabbage head here and start laying those little eggs, and those are going to be those little creepy crawly loopworms that we end up digesting later in the season. So that's what those little white butterflies turn into. It's hard to plant these two together here, of course, just because of our season, but as cabbage is finishing up, you can always plant tomatoes, or if you're going into a fall crop, that would be advantageous to plant your cabbages next to your tomatoes. Cucumbers and nasturtiums planted together are going to help you repel cucumber beetles. And let me preface by saying that a lot of this is not research-based information, but a lot of this is coming out of Farmer's Almanac and things that have been passed down through the years. So we don't have any active research with this at UT at present, but these are just some of those synergistic relationships that we've documented over the years and seem to work. So I would welcome any feedback that y'all would have or anything that works for you too as we move through the rest of the evening. The other thing about cucumbers, because I don't think I have that in the slideshow, but if you plant multiple varieties of cucumbers, then basically you're planting a sacrificial crop for the cucumber beetles. I have a pretty high population of both of these, so what happens is that the bugs themselves don't necessarily cause an issue, but they vector a disease called bacterial wilt. So you'll go to bed one night, your cucumbers look great, you're like, oh, I'm going to pick those tomorrow and make pickles, and you go out the next morning and you're like, okay, who poured scalding hot water on my cucumbers? Because they'll basically wilt overnight. It's really hard to control that bacterial wilt, so if you can try to provide food for this in some other form, because if you have them, then you're always typically going to have them. You've heard me say that before. Once a pest, always a pest. But if you plant multiple varieties of cucumbers, those English cucumbers, they'll actually go to first, just as an FYI. I like to pickle cucumbers, so I'll grow the picklers, and if I plant the English, they'll feast on those. I don't even care if I harvest them. I'll have my picklers to make pickles, so just keep that in mind. If you plant dill with cabbage, that's another one that is going to attract beneficial wasps that are going to control cabbage worms, and we're going to talk a little bit later about some of those beneficial wasps and what they look like. Beans are going to attract beneficial insects that prey on corn, and you can see some of those here. Again, it looks like a butterfly. It's one of those moths. That's what the adult looks like, and then we have the larval form of the fall armyworm. And if we ever see those ears of corn, it's either going to be the earworm or this armyworm that is pretty destructive for sweet corn. But if you plant those together, then we're going to have leafhoppers that'll feast on those. But again, everybody that's on here tonight is going to have a different situation, a different scenario of what they're trying to achieve. Hopefully this will just give you some ideas of some of the things that you can be doing. And we've already talked about three sisters, so I'll skip through that. This is just showing you how you can best utilize spacing. As I was saying earlier, how you can cram a lot of different species together and maximize your space, maximize that efficiency. You can even see some marigolds there. They've got that real pungent odor, which is going to help repel some different species. And of course, you've got some leafy greens that are all interplanted there. And then you have some onions as a border row, which is really cool because, again, onions are going to help repel certain pests just because of that loud, pungent odor. And you can see here that they've gone back and planted radish next to their cabbages. And then that bottom picture, of course, has cole crops, lettuces, and then marigolds all intermingled together. So you don't see a lot of bare ground in many of these pictures because they're trying to maximize their space. They're trying to be a little bit more efficient. Even here, they've got a ground covering, straw covering there. That's, again, anytime we can put a mulch cover, that's going to help that splashing effect from the soil to the fruit. That's going to help us reduce the occurrence of any kind of pathogens being introduced to that fruit. But tomatoes and basil planted together, or even green peppers, if you interplant those with one another, or like you can see here, plant that basil next to tomatoes, that's going to increase the tomatoes' vigor. It's going to help them taste better. They say it makes the tomatoes and the bell peppers a little bit sweeter if you do that. Summer savory was an herb I hadn't really heard of till about a decade ago. There's actually two. There's a summer savory and a winter savory. Summer savory is the annual, winter savory is the perennial. But the summer savory is actually considered by many to be a salt substitute. And it's also a great companion to beans. And it does help deter the Mexican bean beetle. And I know some of you here tonight have had a major problem with the Mexican bean beetles in the past. And again, it's one of those when we have it, we typically always have it. So summer savory might be one of those you'd want to try. It is a smaller, more compact plant than the winter savory, but it does have really nice flavor. A lot of folks will add it to squash and beans because, again, could be considered a salt substitute. Tansy, I don't really have a good picture here to show you of how vigorous this plant really can be. Again, this is one of those I could have dug up from my garden. If you're on the herb talk in a couple of weeks, you'll get to see that live from my garden. But this plant can get as tall as me. It can get about 5 to 6 foot tall. Some people consider it to be an ugly plant when it starts blooming. I kind of like the little yellow flowers and the fern-like foliage, but it can be invasive. It starts sprouting up pretty much everywhere, and it does have a pretty nice size taproot. But the cool thing about it is that it can help reduce ant populations. Of course, this is one you wouldn't want to plant next to your peonies or peonies or pineys, wherever you're from, because of course ants are needed to to pollinate the peonies. But if you've got an ant problem, tansy is one of those that can help reduce those populations. Rue is another one of those moonlight plants. You can see there it's got that silver gray foliage. I know in Europe that they'll plant these intermingled with roses at the end of the vineyard rows. And they say that they do that because it helps with the Japanese beetle populations. It goes back to what I was saying earlier about planting a different variety of cucumbers to just feed the cucumber beetles. It's kind of along those same lines. You're planting a food source for the Japanese beetles because they're going to be here for about 6 weeks every summer. So if we don't want them feasting on our roses and our grapes, some of those higher sensitive crops, I had them eating on basil last year pretty significantly. But rue is one of those that will help deter the Japanese beetles. Horseradish can help repel potato beetle. The thing about horseradish is you've got to be careful with it. Plant it in an open bottom pot because, again, it can spread. It's going to be one of those perennial crops. But a lot of my herb friends in Western North Carolina have said they've had great success with some of those populations of Colorado potato beetles just intermingling the horseradish. And of course the henbit or the dead nettle, both of those are going to help repel potato bugs too. And you've often heard me say that if you see this weed growing in a lawn or wherever it's growing, it usually means that's a high organic matter, very rich soil. So it's not always a bad weed when we see it growing. It can actually indicate to us that we've got a pretty good soil. Fennel, that seems to be growing in popularity here in the U.S. Of course, it's pretty huge in the Asian markets, but if you plant fennel near a dog kennel, it can help reduce flea populations. So probably not quite as effective as maybe cedar. But the other thing about fennel, and some people would disagree with me on this, but I think it's got one of those relationships kind of like a black walnut and a tomato. I think it stunts other crops. I've kind of played around with it several years, and it just seems to stunt a lot of other herbs and vegetables that grow near it. So I'm not sure if there's any scientific evidence to back that up, but there has been some notations about it helping with flea control. So that just is a brief introduction to some of those plant relationships, some of the things that we can kind of get going in our garden. Let's see. I'm going to see if I can pull up chat and answer some questions before we move on. Oh, Rachel, website. Yeah, and some of you that this is your first night in class, I will add you to a Google Drive at the conclusion of tonight, so you'll get a video tonight, and you'll get a couple of different resources. Plus, you'll get the PowerPoint presentation with all my notes, so you'll be added to that. Globe Amaranth, yes, thank you. How far away from a black walnut tree should you not be? You need to be a fir piece, Jerry. Probably at least 100 foot. I don't have any pictures of the legume nodules with me, Trish, no. Where can you find comfrey to buy? Mary, you can come to my house. I will gladly give you some. If you want to plant comfrey under your trees, how far away? You know, you want to give it about a 1 to 2 foot buffer, not right up against the tree bark, but you know, you can still plant it within the root zone. It's going to find its way through the tree roots. It'll intermingle. And can you plant rue and comfrey together? Yeah, I don't see why you couldn't. The only thing is that the comfrey is going to be a little bit more, its growth habitat's going to be a little bit more spready and more upright. The rue's a little bit slower growing, so not quite as vigorous. So you might want to put a little bit of a spacing between those. Let's see how I want to go. Yeah, you can do rue around your grapes in between the plants, yeah. And plus the rue has a really nice yellow flower bloom. And then again, it's got that silver foliage, which is really nice to reflect moonlight. So again, you're just creating an overall environment that it just kind of speaks to the senses throughout the year, and it's a benefit to everybody. So now I wanted to spend a little bit of time on the top 10, and this is just kind of Melody's top 10. It's not really, again, scientific in nature, but just to touch on some of these a little bit more. Probably some of the ones just from experience or attending some herb conferences in the past. I feel like maybe the best bang for your buck, if you will. Okay, why am I not advancing? I've made it mad, y'all. Oh, there we go. Okay, so basil, we've already spoken to that one already. It is a great companion to tomatoes because it is going to improve the growth and the flavor. The other cool thing is that it can help repel tomato hornworms or the tobacco hornworms, and it can repel flies and mosquitoes. I don't know if anybody has ever heard, I can't remember how that goes off the top of my head, but plant a pot of basil at your back door, keeps the flies away. There's a poem there. I'm not very poetic, but it doesn't matter what kind of basil either. Just any pot of basil at the back door keeps the flies away. Borage, again, you can buy one plant of this. All parts of the plant are going to be edible. Of course, it's a early blooming plant, so it's going to attract those beneficial insects pretty early, and then it'll just start reseeding itself. It is a great companion to strawberries. A lot of farmers will interplant that with their strawberries. You see a lot of that in Europe. I've never really seen that done here, but they say it doesn't increase the yield in the flavor. It too will help deter tomato worms, and then it can also improve the growth and flavor of squash. It can be kind of overtaken by squash, so if you do plant it in your garden, you know, kind of try to give it if you plant it next to squash, make sure that the squash is not completely going to shade it out. Be careful with that. Dill, there's a couple of different species on the market, but dill is going to improve the growth and health of your cabbage. It's going to attract some of those beneficial wasps that are going to control cabbage pest. It's going to grow very well with lettuce and onions, and it's also going to serve as a trap crop for the tomato worm. And the other thing is that if you are trying to attract swallowtails or the parsley worm, then this will really draw them. This is another thing like the cucumber beetles I was talking about earlier. Overnight, pretty much devastate your cucumber crop. Same thing. These will just absolutely devour a crop of dill overnight. You'll go out and there'll be one stalk and you'll be like, was that my dill? Marigolds, of course, no southern garden would be complete without marigolds. They do deter nematodes, but I've never known there to be a major problem with nematodes in Greene County. But the other thing that they can help with is the Mexican bean beetles. Just make sure that it is those African marigolds, and the specific species are going to be listed in the handout that you'll get after tonight. They're good companions to bush beans, potatoes, kale, and Chinese cabbage. And that bottom picture there is actually calendula, which is a species of marigold. We call that pot marigold. It's not going to be quite as effective as the marigolds there that you see at the top, because we want them to be a little bit lower growing. Because they're more pungent. Again, their odor is going to be more pungent. And actually a pot marigold would be considered by some to be more fragrant than the original marigolds. Mint, again, we've spoken about mint several times tonight. They are going to be very vigorous growers. They're going to spread, but you can actually bury a pot of that in your garden and just move it around from time to time. I have an aunt that does this with the horseradish. She does that with some of her mint because she swears that it helps improve the flavor of her tomatoes. So I'm not going to do that. I just plant mine in the ground and go with it. Too much work to try to bury a pot, but you know, it can work, especially in raised bed gardens. Just be careful because sometimes that mint will outgrow the pot that you planted in. It's that vigorous in one season. Mint again is going to be a good companion to the brassica family. The flowers are going to attract those beneficial insects. Think back to early in the spring when we're always talking about the hen bit and the dead nettle again. That's one of, you know, those purple flowers that we see early in the spring. What do we always see feasting on them? You know, that's when our pollinators first start coming to life. So any family or any plant in the mint family is going to serve as a good pollinator. And of course, spearmint and peppermint, those are going to help repel aphids and ants, flea beetles, and then the white cabbage butterflies. Nasturtiums, again, that's going to be a plant that's pretty much completely edible. And they're just a pretty addition along with those borage flowers, because you can eat those too. They taste like cucumber, by the way, on the borage. I didn't tell you that earlier. The nasturtium is going to help deter the pumpkin beetles and any of those pests in the brassica family. If you grow them near squash, it's going to repel the squash bugs. Now, there's a difference between squash bug and the squash vine borer, and that's something for another night. But the squash bug is what we see the highest prevalence here later in the summer, moving into those fall months, and you start seeing those little soft spots show up on your pumpkins or your winter squashes, and oftentimes even your summer squash. You can see it if you have a heavy infestation even on your zucchinis and stuff. But you can use nasturtiums as a trap crop for aphids, or just intermingle those with your cucurbic crops to help repel those squash bugs. And you'll notice there that they're a good companion to, again, most of your cold crops and even tomatoes and potatoes. So they're pretty much going to fit in with any of your plant families. Onions have been said for years, and even with the Native American tribes, to promote the health of other plants. Of course, chives, you're going to be able to eat the edible flowers and leaves. And of course, they're going to grow well with tomatoes and carrots. So this is one of those we've had folks complain that they'll lose in the summer months because it gets too hot. But again, if you give it a little bit of shade, you can prolong the life of these. And often they, you know, some people say they can't get them to come back year after year. But if you provide them a little bit of shade that first year, oftentimes that'll give them the relief they need, and they'll perform better the second year. Onions are going to be good companions again to any of the cold crops, and tomatoes, Swiss chard, you can interplant with any of those. They've been known to, garlic has been known to deter Japanese beetles, aphids, fruit tree borers, and spider mites. So if anybody has some fruit trees, that might be something you want to maybe plant nearby to help deter some of those fruit tree borers, because we're starting to see a higher occurrence of those here in Northeast Tennessee. We're getting about as high in numbers there as Middle Tennessee is. So we're starting to see some of the pressure from some of those pests as they start inching further east. You'll notice that word insectary. Onion family members are good insectary plants because they're attracting predatory insects that are going to feed on pest insects. And again, that's another class for another night, but oftentimes if we are utilizing insecticide in our gardens to kill a specific pest, we don't think about the damage that we're doing to all pests. You know, an insecticide doesn't know a beneficial bug from a bad bug. So again, when we're utilizing some of these companion planting in our garden, we're actually, hopefully, again, building that diverse ecosystem to where we can reduce some of the occurrences of that. And we're actually allowing some of those beneficial bugs, we're introducing those populations where they can come in and eat some of those bad bug populations. Oregano, this is one that's pretty simple to grow. It is an aromatic herb. And of course, there's multiple varieties of this, but it's been known to deter any kind of squash family insect, the squash vine borer. I have tried this and I've not had very much success. I'll just tell you with the squash vine borer. I have a little bit more success. For those of you that don't know what the squash vine borer is, it is an insect that bores into the stem right at the ground level of squash plants. And it basically just tunnels its way in there, and the stem will just break over. You can actually go in and dig the squash vine borer out and wrap aluminum foil around the squash plant, maybe salvage it. But usually when I plant the seed, I'll use a toilet roll holder and plant that in the ground, because then I've got a natural barrier, but then it'll break down by the end of the season. Or you can use a ring of aluminum foil. When that plant comes up, put a ring of aluminum foil around it. Or you can use those that come off of a gallon milk jug or gallon water jug, that little plastic ring. You can also, one of those that the old timey ones, I guess, because some of them you just whip off. This is when I wish I could show you things. I can't show you things on Zoom, but anyway, the old plastic ring, you can use one of those to put around your squash as it's coming up, and that'll help repel the vine borer to a certain degree. But the oregano, you might want to give that an opportunity if you've had some major occurrences of that. Oregano has also been known to repel flea beetles, and it is a good companion to broccoli. Radish, for anybody that's taken any of my garden classes in the last 10 years knows that I say radish is the powerhouse of the garden. It's a very versatile crop. It's a fast growing crop. It's cheap. You can buy seeds by the pound for next to nothing. It's going to serve as a companion to many different species. You can see them all listed there. But the big thing here is that they're going to be used as a trap crop. And you can just sow the seeds throughout the gardening season just to serve that one purpose. If you plant them next to cucumbers and squash, it's going to help lure away the cucumber beetles. They're also going to lure away flea beetles from the cabbage family. Probably not everybody has a major occurrence of flea beetles on here. They kind of strike it, I don't know, I see them in different populations throughout the county. So some of you may have never even seen one, but some of you are probably inundated with them. So planting radishes throughout the growing season, keeping them growing all season long is a good practice to get into. Sunflowers, we consider those to be a very beneficial plant. A lot of people don't think about them just because they are a flower, but they can be used as a shade to your vine crops and to your greens. You can actually use them to grow your pole beans, again, if you're trying to maximize space, and utilize them for that. They can attract birds to the gardens, and certain bird species are going to feast on insects. Again, that's going to depend on what populations you have. And then they're going to be a good companion to cucumbers. And that armyworm is going to be a thing of the past when you plant sunflowers with your corn. Okay, I'm going to go to the chat box right quick before we move on. There is a Mexican marigold, and that sheet will have specific species of which ones to use in your garden setting. Anything you can plant with container blueberries. Blueberries pretty much like anything. I don't think blueberries have any enemies, actually, Sue. They don't have a lot of pests really, except for the spotted wing Drosophila. What would repel flea beetles on sunflowers? Plant radishes in between your sunflowers. And you can pretty well sow those all at the same time, because the sunflower will come back and overtake the radish anyway. And then you can harvest the radish and just keep sowing them. I've heard of the Four Sisters adding sunflowers. Yes, you can do that. Some people will interchange sunflowers with corn, but you can add the sunflowers to the corn as well. And bees do love sunflowers. Good point, Pam. Robin, you have tent caterpillars. Get rid of your cherry trees. Linda, is nasturtium planted as seed or started indoors? Actually, I have better success planting it by seed, but you can buy the 6-packs too. Which, Linda, I'm glad you asked that. That's a good question. We often talk about cucurbits, and I don't know if I'm going to teach this somewhere else in another class or not, but I'm going to go ahead and throw that out there. Squash seeds or cucumber seeds will actually perform better than if you plant a transplant. Squash roots or cucurbit roots don't like to be disturbed. So do this little experiment. Buy you a 6-packet at Lowe's or somewhere, and then plant seeds the same day and see if the seeds don't overtake your transplants. And they typically, 9 times out of 10, will be more hardy and more vigorous than what you are going to plant as a transplant, if that makes sense. Let me do this one more and then I'll get into the rest of it. Intersect, whoa, where'd it go? Blueberries like parsley and radishes. Yeah, everybody loves radishes. Everybody loves radishes, yeah. It came up after all the damage was done to, I bet that means cucumbers, don't it, Linda? Yeah, you got to plant them about the same time to get those, to get the most benefit from the nasturtium, for sure. Okay, so we're getting into some other odd uses maybe you hadn't thought about as far as companions or even in the household. Every time I go to that chat box, it locks me up for some reason. Okay, bay leaf. You can take bay leaf. Some people actually grow that in pots here in Greene County. I know a couple of people that have them that are rather large. But if you have ladybug infestations, you can spread bay leaf around your house where they're congregating, and they should leave. If you grow beets, even if you don't like beets, I'm not a beet lover at all, but I'll always grow a few because they're going to add minerals to the soil. So just like our bodies, they say, you know, high amounts of magnesium and iron, same way for our garden. So the leaves are composed of magnesium, and it makes them a valuable addition to your compost. And they're also beneficial to beans, except for runner beans. So keep that in mind, because it can stunt your runner beans for whatever reason. If you have blue lake beans, just the standard bush bean, you can plant beets right alongside of them. But if they're the heritage whole runner beans, then keep them separated. Catnip, of course, besides your cats loving them, they'll help deter flea beetles and Japanese beetles, squash bugs, and ants and weevils. And then, of course, if you steep that catnip in water and sprinkle it on plants, it'll also help drive away flea beetles. And you can actually see flea beetle damage on catnip when you're using it as a barrier crop. You'll actually, I mean, the plants will almost be black. They're doing some research actually on that at the Fletcher Station over in North Carolina. Celery, I don't know if anybody's ever tried to grow celery. It's one of those longer day crops, so sometimes we can be successful with it here. If nothing else, it's just fragrant in the garden, but the cabbage looper is going to be repelled by that scent, so it's going to be a good companion to any of your cole crops again. And if you choose, you could even leave the celery, if you're growing a fall crop of those cole crops, just leave the celery throughout the season to serve that purpose. 4 o'clocks is going to draw Japanese beetles like you would not believe. And you can, again, just grow 4 o'clocks as a trap crop. The foliage is going to be pure poison to them and going to knock them out cold. Just remember that 4 o'clocks are going to be toxic to you and pets as well, so be careful with that. Horseradish, I kind of alluded to this earlier. Just make sure that you plant it in containers in the potato patch. That's going to help keep the Colorado potato bugs at bay. And it's going to increase the disease resistance of potatoes. And then, of course, there's going to be some insecticide sprays that we can utilize from that root. And again, just using the bottomless pot method is going to help keep that horseradish contained. And if any of you have ever had blister beetles, those little black beetles, it can help repel those. Again, that's going to be like the flea beetle. It depends on where you're at, if that's a major occurrence for you or not. Horehound, I kind of talked about that a little bit earlier, but the other good thing about horehound is that it's going to attract the brachynoid wasp and the syrphid flies. And if any of you have ever seen the like a soft-bodied caterpillar, like a hornworm, and you see these like little white egg casings on the top of it, and it looks like that caterpillars just died from within, melted from within, that's what that is. That's one of those tachnid or syrphid flies. So it's actually predatory on those soft-bodied caterpillars. So horehound's one of those that's really going to draw those populations in. And you'll notice there that second bullet, it's going to grow where many others fail to thrive, and it's going to stimulate and aid in fruiting tomatoes and peppers. The one thing about horehound, it can get a little leggy, almost rubbery, so you do have to keep it pruned back year to year, but I usually wait till like this time of year to prune that back, just to keep that cover, I guess, for the birds. Lemon balm, you can sprinkle that throughout your garden in an herbal powder mixture. That's going to help deter a lot of bugs, again, just because it's so fragrant. It can fend off squash bugs. It does have those citronella compounds, so just crush and rub the leaves on your skin. That can help keep the mosquitoes away when you're outside working in the garden. Plus, you'll smell really nice too. Lovage or Angelica, either one, they're very similar in their growth characteristics. And if you've never had lovage butter, the compound butter, I only grow lovage for that purpose. I love it. I'll chop up fresh lovage and make a butter and use that through the summer months. But lovage serves as a good habitat for ground beetles, and it's going to help improve the flavor of most of your plants. Now, you're probably saying, why would I want a habitat for ground beetles when every other beetle you're saying all these plants repel? But again, we do have some good beneficial beetles. Beetles are one of those larger populations of species, like literally hundreds of thousands of species of beetles in the world. But those ground beetles are going to help eat a lot of other insect pests. So we really want to encourage higher populations of those. Marjoram is a pretty small, compact plant, but we, of course, use that in a lot of our beef dinners, but it also will help increase the yield of most of your garden veggies. So even interplanting that in between rows or in between the plants within the rows. It'll serve as a good ground cover, plus you get to utilize that throughout the season. Now, some of you are going to shoot me on this one, and myself included, because you've heard me tell the story before. Some of you, when I went through my divorce several years ago, the garden was full steam ahead, and then I came back in the fall and all I had was morning glories and nutsedge. So I wasn't too happy about the whole morning glory population. But the good thing is that they attract hoverflies. So I had to dig deep and find the positive in the morning glories, because again, that's been about a decade and I still have a pretty high population of these in my garden area, but I kind of just let them do their thing. They grow with the pole beans on any trellis support system I've got in the garden. Sunflowers serve as a natural trellis, so plus I'm attracting the hoverflies, and the hoverflies look like a bee, but they're not a bee. They're actually a beneficial insect that devours aphids and flea beetles, spider mites, and any of those little soft-bodied insects. And then parsley is kind of cool because it's said to increase the fragrance of roses when you plant them around their base. But do remember that mint and parsley are enemies. So you can plant mint with rose and you can plant parsley with rose, but don't intermingle them together. The mint will stunt the parsley. That's a kind of a cool science experiment. If you have kids, you might want to play around with that, since mint's not that expensive. You can just uproot it and put it anywhere, get you a little sprig of parsley, and it's kind of cool to see that. So just keep those away from one another. Sweet potatoes, we talked about potatoes being in the nightshade family and the solanaceous family. Sweet potatoes are not. They're actually in the morning glory family. So you want to keep those planted away from squash. It can stunt your squash back. And then yarrow has a natural insect repellent quality, and it works pretty good as a natural fertilizer. If you just cut it back, keep it cut back, kind of like the comfrey and the borage, and you can just keep adding that to your compost bin or adding that to your rows in the garden and your raised bed or whatever. Yarrow is also going to attract those predatory wasps that we were talking about earlier, and ladybugs. And of course, ladybugs are going to feast on aphids. So anytime we've got really succulent growth, like in tomatoes, when they're first starting to grow in the springtime, aphids can be an issue. So if you have yarrow nearby, that can help with some of that. Yarrow is also going to increase the essential oil content of herbs when you have that interplanted amongst some of those oily herbs. And then a handful of yarrow leaves added to your compost pile will help speed that process up. Peanuts, folks have often considered peanuts hard to grow here, or that we couldn't grow it here because our soil was way too heavy. Most of us have that heavy clay soil. But if you keep amending your soil and building that tilth over time and get a good supply of organic matter, you can grow peanuts, and they're actually very tasty. But the cool thing about peanuts, again, they're a legume, but they're also going to help encourage the growth of corn and squash. So kind of like that Three Sisters, they're going to serve the same purpose that the beans would serve. And petunias, remember, they are a member of the nightshade family. Remember too that they are, if you have petunias, you surely know that slugs will feast on petunias. So you can use petunias as a trap crop for slugs, especially if you have hostas in your landscape. Just as an FYI, I don't have that in here, but you can use the leaves to make a potent bug spray, because remember, the solanaceous has those secondary alkaloids that we utilize in some of those insecticides. It's a good companion to tomatoes, again, same family, but they can repel asparagus beetles. So some of you that have asparagus growing in your garden plots may want to consider that as a border plant. They can deter Mexican bean beetles, and just overall just serve as a good deterrent, because again, you've got that smell. Alyssum is a good living mulch for potatoes. A lot of the old timers would plant this in between the potatoes, and then you can use comfrey leaves and plant those in furrow when you plant your potatoes to help control scab. And scab is just that physiological disease where it's too wet. And you know, our soils are really, really wet in the springtime, so scab can be an issue. You can still eat them, they just don't look pretty, but comfrey can help repel some of that. Rhubarb is going to be a good companion to any of your brassica family. It's going to help protect beans from black fly. And again, that's going to be an occurrence. Not everybody's going to have the same pressure. If you have columbines, it can help reduce the numbers of red spider mites, which they love columbines for whatever reason. And you'll see there oxalic acid can be used on your roses to prevent black spot. Okay, so we're getting ready to wind up here. I put several different charts in here because those of you that actually come to my classes know I'm more visual and like to do some hands-on things with this particular class. But you'll have these to serve as a reference as you start moving through the season. You'll see what you can plant as a good companion and what's a bad companion. And there's just some different schematics in here that show you some of that. And all of the location that or the websites where I found these, I left on here. So you'll be able to access that. I really like this one because I think it just demonstrates a little bit better how you can pack so much into a smaller area. And even if you're growing in raised beds, you can utilize the same format on both of these. But you can see kind of how you would intermingle. Oftentimes when we plant gardens, we think we have to do it row by row, and you don't necessarily have to do that. You can do it in blocks or even in diagonals and kind of see how some of that stuff is here. Now the amaranth here is not pigweed. I got in trouble for that one time. That's actually a grain that people will use for bread baking. Okay, so what do y'all think? Did you know plants could be that cool?
No.
I'm going to go back to the chat box right quick.
Yeah, this is wonderful. Very educational.
Cool. Tori controls tent caterpillars by spraying the nest with vegetable oil. Spray at dusk when the caterpillars return to the nest. Mary agrees with the cucumbers. The seeded ones overtake the transplants. You hope the beetles won't hurt the moonflowers. Yeah, I hope they don't either. No, I hope not. It just kind of depends on your populations, yeah. Rachel asked about 4 o'clocks under your fruit trees. Would that be better than comfrey? Either one. 4 o'clock's, well, I was getting ready to say it would be cheaper to get started, but actually either one of them. You can start with just one and they grow fastly. Even if celery is tough after a long season, it is good dehydrated. That's true. Yeah, because it does get that woody fiber. Morning glories that come up, yeah, I hate those too. Okay, I think that's it we have in there. I'm going to hit save the thing. Okay, all right, so do y'all have questions? I'm glad y'all joined me. It is a fun class. I just wish that we were face-to-face. It makes it a little bit more fun. Oh, so the things that I am going to give you, hang on a minute, let me end this thing and pull this up. So this is a really lengthy, or no, this one's not. This one has just a chart that's going to show you. Can you see that?
Oh yeah.
Okay. It's just a one-pager that's going to tell you, again, plant families, what they like to be with and what they don't like to be with. And then the other handout you're going to get is pretty lengthy. I think it's like 12 or 13 pages. I'm going really fast. But it's going to give you each plant and tell you what it's good to plant with. It's just a really cool guide. Kind of gives you some ideas as you work through your garden planning. But if y'all have other things that work, I think that's what the beauty of this is what works for everybody, or what works for one person doesn't work for everybody. It all kind of depends on what our pest populations are. I see some of you on here, and I kind of know from past experience what some of the issues each of you are dealing with. And unfortunately, we can't completely rid ourselves of some of those things, but we can keep building our soil, keep building our ecosystem, and it really helps encourage the good bugs to come in. Our common sage, thyme, oregano, and rosemary perennial in this area. I lost my chat box. Yes, the only one that might be questionable is rosemary. You've really got to protect it from the harsh winters here, Bill. It can be kind of iffy, so you might want to put it in a more protected location if you can, or keep it mulched or something like that. But the others do well. Crop rotation, Glenn wants to know if it's best to keep it at 3 years. Yeah, and that's another class. That's another class that will speak to all of that on, but the crop rotation, yeah, if you can get on a 3-year rotation, that's best. And even if you're in raised beds, 2 things I really encourage are the cover cropping and the crop rotation, which I think some people might be ready to kill me after last year putting rye on their raised beds, because it is kind of a beast to try to go in and fork that under, but that's probably 2 best things you can do to build your soil. Was that one of y'all on here? Was that you, Angela? Yeah, but I swear it is 2 of the best practices you can get involved with, I promise. So I've been using living mulch on my raised beds. Yes, living mulch is perfect. We didn't speak to that tonight, but buckwheat and clover, if you use a living mulch, are 2 of the really good ones to use. Buckwheat can get a little bit taller, but it's a great pollinator too. And even if you're just using clover to walk on, to tramp it to death, that's okay too. We don't want to see much bare ground, if any, because anytime we have that soil contact, any of that splash factor is when we're going to introduce pathogens. And typically when we introduce pathogens, it makes the fruit soft, and then we invite those insect pests in, right? So if we can keep those occurrences down, the better off we're going to be long term.